pritarėte prie, kad tą ciklą pradeda profesorius Borg iš Malmės universiteto. Norėčiau trumpai pasakyti, labai trumpai visus jo darbus ir nuopelnus, tai jo mokslinių interesų sritys yra švietimo sociologija, ugdymo programų teorija, kritinė pedagogika, suaugusių švietimas, siekiant darnaus bendruomenės vystymosi, tėvų įtraukimas į ugdymo procesą. Ir jis yra įvairių mokslinių publikacijų autorius, taip pat yra Europos komisijos švietimo ekspertas, patariantis suaugusių švietimo ir aukštojo mokslo klausimais. Tai iš tikrųjų tai mane eilinį lektorių šiandien ir tiesiog linkiu, ačiū jam, kad jis pasakė, ir linkiu visiems turiningo.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation. A little bit about myself. This is my basically 26th year in the profession. I've always been in the profession, so I taught at different levels in education, and for the last 20 years I was involved in teacher formation. So what I share with you today is basically my experience, my concrete experience of forming teachers, not only locally in my country but internationally.
Taigi, profesorius 26 metus dirba mokytojo darbą ir 20 šių būtent su pačiais mokytojais jų mokymą kaip tapti geresniais mokytojais. Taigi, jis turi daug patirties šioje srityje.
Okay, so my pedagogy is generally dialogical in nature, so I dialogue with, my audience rather than transmit knowledge. But obviously our time is very short, and there will be a lot of me and perhaps less of you in this particular session.
Pats dėstytojas mėgsta savo paskaitose užsiimti dialogus su studentais, tačiau šį kartą, kadangi laikas ribotas, turbūt bus daugiau jo kalbėjimo apie jūsų, nes jam labai patinka kalbėti su savo studentais ir išmokti iš jų.
Now, because my pedagogy is based on dialogue, generally, I obviously open myself to transformation into dialogue. But there are a few things which I'm going to start with where I believe really firmly in these aspects.
Kadangi jo mokymas yra susijęs su dialogu, jis pats per tą dialogą dažnai keičia savo nuomonę, kažkokia kaita jo paskaitose vyksta, bet jis pradės tais dalykais dabar, kuriais labai tiki.
Okay. Number one, a teaching community which is not open to reflection is a weak community.
Taigi, pirmas dalykas, kuriuo jis labai įsitikinęs yra, kad mokytojų bendruomenė, kuri netiki
reflection.
Kuri nėra pasiruošus reflektuoti, yra bloga.
So that's point number one, which I really believe in. Point number two is that a teaching community which is not interested in what is happening around it and is only interested in the classroom is a poor community.
Taip pat antras dalykas, kad mokytojų bendruomenė, kuri nesidomi tuo, kas vyksta už pamokų ribų ir už klasės ribų, bus prasta mokytojų bendruomenė.
A teaching community which is afraid of change is also a weak community.
Taip pat mokytojai, kurie bijo keistis, irgi bus prasti mokytojai.
A teaching community which is comfortable in its small space called the classroom is a very weak community.
Mokytojų bendruomenė, kurie jaučiasi patogiai tik tai savo uždaroje klasės erdvėje, irgi bus prasta.
A teaching community which does not understand that there is a connection between the outside world and education is also a very weak community.
Mokytojai, kurie nesupranta, kad tarp pasaulio ir mokslų, kuriuos jie atlieka, nėra ryšio, irgi bus prasti.
Indifference and lack of position is a decision that teachers can take, but it's a position. It's not a neutral position.
Taigi nežinojimas, kas vyksta ir neturėjimas kažkokios tai savo pozicijos pasaulyje vykstančiais dalykais apie juos yra pozicija, kurios mokytojai turi užsiema, tačiau tai irgi yra prastas pasirinkimas.
Which brings me to today's lecture. It's education for social justice, policies, pedagogies, and beyond. So the focus is on social justice, which is basically speaking about inclusion. And my statement, and very strong statement, is that there is no democracy without social justice, there is no democracy without inclusion. So inclusion, as far as I am concerned, is not an option. It's not a choice. If we believe in democracy, therefore, as a teaching community, we should be not only interested in inclusion, but work for inclusion.
Taigi visą tai siejasi su socialinio teisingumo tema švietime. Ir jis tiki, kad demokratijos negali būti be socialinio teisingumo ir inkliuzijos ugdyme.
So there's a lot of rhetoric about democracy in all countries in Europe, including this country. But we have to understand that there is no democracy without real inclusion. And education plays a very important role in democracy and therefore in inclusion and social justice.
Taigi, turime suprasti, kad apie demokratiją Europos Sąjungoje ir mūsų šalyje vyksta daug diskusijų, tačiau be demokratijos nėra be inkliuzijos, kuri turi būti įtraukta į mūsų švietimą.
And the only way we can consolidate democracy is by doing democracy and not just speaking about democracy. And this is what I'm here for today. Okay, to speak about the doing part of inclusion, of democracy, of social justice in education, and we are part of that.
Taigi šiandien kalbės apie tai, kaip praktiškai pritaikyti demokratiją mokymo procese, nes nežinodami, kaip praktiškai tai pritaikyti, mes negalime to patys užsiimti.
So let's start with the objective truth. This is not subjectivity here, it's the objective truth. As you can see, 80 million in 2013, 80 million in Europe were hovering around the poverty line. Now this is one indicator of how unequal Europe is. Within 10 years we would have 100 million, okay, of people in Europe, in the European Union, okay, hovering around the poverty line. So there is a social justice issue. It's not a figment of Carmel Borg's imagination. Inequality, oppression, etc. Is a reality in Europe. And it's a reality around us. It's not a problem of Spain, of Greece, okay, of Germany, whatever. It's a problem of us here in Lithuania. So we cannot just ignore it. This is one of many facts. I will not bore you with facts. But this is enough to show you that Europe is facing a social justice, a serious social justice issue.
Taigi, skaidrėse matome vieną statistiką, kuri iliustruoja socialinio teisingumo stoką Europos Sąjungoje būtent. Tai yra faktas, kad 16,4% gyventojų Europos Sąjungoje gyvena žemiau skurdo ribos. Ir tas skaičius žmonių metams bėgant tik tai augs, jeigu nesiimsime kažkokių veiksmų. 80 milijonų žmonių iš viso.
Okay. This is the statistic for children now. 20.2% of children under 16 years of age are poor, okay, in Europe.
Taigi, o 20% vaikų Europoje gyvena skurde. Būtent iš tų žmonių vaikai yra 20%, kurie gyvena skurde.
Now, that is enough as regards statistics, because I'm not here to bore you with statistics, but it gives you an indication, okay, that Europe is anything but equal.
Iš šitos statistikos jūs matote, kad Europa tikrai nėra lygia teisė. Žmonės gyvena skirtingose lygiuose pragyvenimo.
Okay, now there is a very intimate relationship between, if we take poverty, and education chances of our children.
Taigi yra labai aiškus ryšys tarp skurdo ir vaikų gyvenančių skurde ir jų galimybių gauti gerą švietimą.
Now schools play a very important part And the choice is between schools that reproduce inequality or schools that intervene, obviously with parents, to stop the cycle of inequality.
Taigi mokyklos yra labai svarbios šioje problemoje ir jos sprendime. Ir yra skirtumas tarp mokyklų, kurios tiesiog tęsia tą nelygybės problemą, nieko nedarydamas, ir mokyklų, kurios imasi veiksmų įtraukdamos tėvus ir bendruomenę į mokyklų pavertimą lygesniomis požiūrio žmonės. Taip, mokyklos taip pat reprodukuoja, aš nežinau, kaip žodis, pratęsia tą nelygybę visuomenėje, jeigu jos nesiema reikiamų veiksmų.
And this is a very serious ethical and moral challenge that we teachers in here, okay, have to confront. It's not something that we can run away from.
Taigi visi čia esantis mokytojai ir mokytojai tikrai turėtų susidurti su šia etinė ir moralinė problema ir ją bandyti spręsti.
And the easiest thing, of course, for us all is to ignore that there are these issues and cater for people without problems.
Aišku, mums lengviausia yra užmiršti, kad tokios problemos egzistuoja ir dirbti su žmonėmis, kurie nepatiria tokių problemų.
Okay, these are three typical reactions of many teachers I have met, okay, internationally, not in my country, but internationally. One of them is blaming the victim. The child is not performing because he or she is careless, because his or her parents do not care about education, etc. So blaming the victim. That's the first reaction. We have nothing to do with it. It's the child's problem. It's the family's problem.
Okay, tai yra kelios reakcijos, kuriomis jis susiduria įvairiose šalyse dėstydamas. Pirmoji yra kaltinti auką, taigi sakyti, kad vaikas blogai mokosi, kad jo tėvai pakankamai nedaro, kad jis geriau mokosi ir tiesiog kaltinamas yra vaikas.
When we decide that the child is a problem, the second reaction comes in. Let's fix him or her, okay?
Nusprendus, kad būtent vaikas yra problema, ateina antra reakcija, kas yra pabandyti sutvarkyti problemą, taigi pabandyti kažkaip sutvarkyti tą vaiką, kuris patiria.
The third issue is the romanticization of education. Education alone is the solution. That is also a misjudged, idea. No, education is one aspect of the solution. There are other, influences on the solution. Poverty does not start in the school. Poverty starts outside and there are structural issues. So to think that education and teachers can solve all the world's problems is also a misguided, idea.
Taigi trečia reakcija yra manyti, kad būtent švietimas ištaisys visas problemas, kurios atsiranda ir už klasės ribų. Pavyzdžiui, skurdas nėra atsirandantis mokykloje, vaikai jame auga ir ateina į mokyklą iš tos aplinkos. Tačiau manimas, kad būtent švietimas viską ištaisys, neatsižvelgiant į kitus aspektus, irgi yra klaidinga pozicija.
So education, as teachers, are part of the solution and not the whole solution. There are lots of things that can happen outside the school and should happen outside the school to address the issue of inequality.
Taigi mes kaip mokytojai ir pats švietimas yra tiesiog dalis problemos sprendimo, bet ne visas problemos sprendimas. Ir mes turim reaguoti į tai, kas vyksta ir už mokyklos ribų tam, kad išspręstume tą problemą.
So this is, in my opinion, the most positive approach, the social justice approach. It's multidimensional and it incorporates policies, contexts, learning contexts, curriculum, pedagogies, etc. It's multidimensional, as I will explain in a few minutes.
Taigi, jo manymu teisingiausias požiūris į šią problemą yra socialinio teisingumo požiūris, kuris įkomponuoja įvairius dalykus kaip mokymasi patys, mokymosi strategijos, mokymosi planai, tvarkaraštis ir bando spręsti problemą įvairiapusiškai.
Before I move into the classroom and into the school, I would like to give you the larger picture of policies in education.
Taigi, pirmiau norėtų jums papasakoti daugiau apie švietimo politiką
So where do these policies come from? They come from comparative studies, okay, based on the idea of what is working in different international contexts. So this part of my session represents a synthesis, okay, a summary of what is working elsewhere in terms of social justice and education. Unfortunately, we still have many countries who undervalue, okay, the role of early childhood education, not only in the child's educational journey, but in terms of social justice in education.
Deja, vis dar daug šalių nuvertina svarbą ankstyvojo ugdymo vaikams ir jo svarbą vėlesniam ugdymui.
Now, by early childhood education, I personally mean 0 to 7 years or 8 years at maximum.
Tas ankstyvasis ugdymas yra vaikams nuo 0 iki 7 arba 8 daugiausiai metų.
And I cannot but overemphasize in certain areas the importance of the 0 to 3 years sector.
Ir labai svarbus yra 0 iki 3 metų vaikų grupė.
Okay. We know through research that differences between students or pupils or children start very early, okay, in life from the word go.
Tie skirtumai gebėjime mokytis vaikuose pradeda formuotis labai anksti. Todėl labai svarbu yra griebtis problemos nuo ankstyvo amžiaus.
We have enough research across Europe showing us that in the first 3 years, the differences between the poorest children and the most privileged children is already of 1 year in terms of language development and school readiness.
Europoje tyrimai rodo, kad skirtumas tarp vaikų nuo 0 iki 3 metų, kurie ateina iš pasiturinčios aplinkos ir vaikų, kurie ateina iš skurdesnės aplinkos, jau yra tas, kad tų iš geresnės aplinkos atėjusių vaikų lygis mokėjimo kalbos yra vienais metais labiau pažengęs už tų, kurie atėjo iš skurdesnės aplinkos.
So I have been advocating, okay, with my government and other governments the importance of the 0 and 3 sector, not only for the children, but also for their families. So the best programs that we have internationally are programs which do not work only with children, but work with their families. So they are family-oriented programs rather than children-oriented programs.
Taigi jis savo šalyje dirba daug su tuo, kad būtų atkreiptas dėmesys į šią problemą ir kad būtų daugiau dirbama su vaikais ir būtent jų šeimomis, kurios turi vaikus nuo 0 iki 3 metų.
That is one dimension of early childhood. The other dimension is good quality early childhood provision. In my country, we provided free universal daycare centers as from this year. But it happened so suddenly that I have my reservations regarding the quality of provision that we are providing right now. So it's not just early childhood provision, but very good quality, okay, provision in terms of early childhood.
Svarbu yra teikti nuo ankstyvosios vaikystės švietimą vaikams, tačiau taip pat svarbu, kad tas švietimas būtų geros kokybės. Pavyzdžiui, Maltoje, supratau, nuo šių metų yra teikiamas tas ankstyvosios vaikystės kaip darželiai įsteigti visiems vaikams, tačiau tai buvo padaryta taip greitai, kad yra dvejonių dėl to švietimo kokybės.
The worst thing that can happen to a disadvantaged child is to find himself or herself in an early childhood or primary provision which is very, very bad quality.
Labai blogai būtų, jeigu vaikas atėjęs iš skurdžios aplinkos, iš neturėdamas daug galimybių į švietimą, jis ateitų į aplinką, kurioje tas švietimas yra prastos kokybės.
So that is point number 1 in terms of policy in education that addresses the issue of social justice. Point 2, and I don't know what is happening here, but we know through research that early streaming damages the child, particularly the disadvantaged child. So wherever we have early streaming in education, we have high proportions of failure. And when we analyze that failure, we find that disadvantaged children are overrepresented in that failure. So let's avoid early streaming. When you stream children very early, able children, not so able, poor children and children. And we know through research that once a child finds himself or herself in the lower stream, there is very little mobility to other streams. He is or she is basically condemned for life. We also know through research that teachers, have different expectations for different streams. Low expectations for the lower streams, higher expectations for the high streams. So when people from the highest ranking countries in PISA are interviewed, there's always one phrase that comes up: high expectations for all. Third policy decision here: strengthen the links between school and home to help disadvantaged parents or any parents help their children to learn. This is my baby, so I can spend whole days discussing this issue. The importance of parental participation and the importance of parental involvement, not only in homes, helping their children in homes, but also involvement inside the school. Now, on parental involvement and parental participation, there are trucks and trucks and trucks of research. So there is no doubt that there is a link, very strong link, between parental involvement and all aspects of the child's development, be it physical development, be it creative development, be it language development, be it social development, be it academic achievement, whatever. There is no doubt, after 40 years of solid international research, that it is in the best interest of all children, to have their parents participating and involved in their own education. there is one research which really impressed me. And it started off in 1997, and it's still going on. It's longitudinal research, and it focuses on parents in disadvantaged homes. And I will tell you a bit about this research. This research shows that money is not the most important determinant in the child's educational achievement. What is impressive about these homes, by the way, it's a research that happened with 3,000 children, so it's not a small research, is that despite the fact that these are very humble homes, parents were interested, were motivated, had time for the students, and met schools which believed in parental involvement. So these parents, by and large, because they met quality schools, were most welcome to participate not only inside the home, but also within schools. So parental involvement is about inclusion. We cannot speak about inclusion in schools, we cannot speak about democratic schools, and then we leave parents outside, in the cold. Now, in my country, we are experimenting with different levels of participation, ranging from parents as audience to parents as policymakers within the school. Where there is participation, there is ownership. And therefore there is less trouble, less miscommunication, more dialogue, and therefore a solid school. No, they are involved and consulted in policy making inside the school. I've been involved in this movement for the last 20 years, and I've never had any trouble. No parents eating my ears, no parents scratching me, nothing. But obviously, you need schools that are really open to dialogue. You cannot approach parents in a hierarchical mentality. Okay? So vertical relationships do not work with the concept of parental involvement. So basically my message is we need a change in attitude, we need a change in the issue of frame of mind. So we cannot move to a genuine, inclusive education system with this mentality of hierarchy, with this mentality of vertical relationships, with this mentality of prescription. There needs to be a change up here. So inclusion cannot happen in a relationship which is marked by verticality. That has to stop. Okay? And we are part of that, culture. So we need to think about our relationship. Yes. Final thing, before I move to the school and to the classroom, is basically the best systems in terms of social justice. Shall I stop a bit? Now, another policy statement that is connected to real inclusion is the early identification of children. And that is why I give a lot of importance to early childhood education. A lot of work needs to be done very early in the child's life, in terms of identifying his or her needs, in terms of identifying his, family's needs, etc. And provide a good plan around those needs. So let me make it very clear, and this is my 26 years of concrete experience in the classrooms, in the schools, etc. If we lose a child from primary, that child might be lost forever. I'm not trying to dramatize it, but I know that at secondary level then, things start becoming very, very complex around the child. So it's very difficult to recover a child lost in primary and pre-primary, of course. So those are some. There are much more in terms of policies, but I know some of you are eager to move nearer to the school and nearer to the classroom. But there are decisions that need to be made in terms of the overarching context, and that's policy. But before I move to the schools, I have to make a very important statement. That policies are not simply for experts, for policymakers, but also for us. We can influence policy if we decide to do so. We're too big a number not to be taken seriously. That's my message for the thousands of teachers, around the globe. We're big. We're very influential. So our silence, is not the best way forward. policies have a direct impact on what we do inside the classroom and what we do in school. So it's inconceivable for me not to be interested in policies.
Jis sako, kad betarpiškai iš tikrųjų yra susiję tai, ką mes veikiame klasėje ir tai, kas yra sakoma mūsų dokumentuose švietimo ir dar aš neišverčiau prieš tai, jis sakė, kad mus turi dominti iš tikrųjų ta politika, tai jie nėra atskira, jie turi tiesiog įtaką.
But it takes more than policies to create, an inclusive, a truly, a genuinely, an authentic, inclusive system.
Bet sukurti tikrai inkluzinę sistemą, tai nepakanka vien politikos, yra dar ir kiti aspektai.
Yes, and obviously after policies, we can speak in terms of inclusive cultures in our schools and inclusive practices in our schools and in our classroom. And here we cannot run away, because this is my and our life, basically.
Ir kaip jis sako, matot, tai ne tik atitinkama politika, bet ir kultūros, inkluzinės kultūros sukūrimas ir inkluzinės praktikos ėmimasis, tai yra kiti du veiksniai, kuriais jūs čia esate susiję.
So it is difficult, okay? It is difficult to have inclusive schools operating within exclusive education systems. So the policies, the cultures, and the practices are intimately tied. If you're dreaming of a change in the system, these three elements have to change. In English we say we cannot square the circle. You cannot have inclusive practices, okay, inside the classroom unless you have inclusive cultures within the schools and inclusive education system.
Švietimo sistemoje, kuri pagrįsta
Now, the easiest thing for us, and I have lots of problems with my teachers back home, is to say, policies have to change first. I cannot do anything in my classroom unless, policies change. And we start the blaming game. Blaming the director, blaming the minister, blaming everybody. And never, asking myself about what I'm doing.
Didžiausia problema, sako mokytoja, kad mokytojai sako, kol nepasikeis sistema, švietimas, politika, tai aš nieko negaliu padaryti. Tai tas kaltinimo žaidimas yra labai didelė.
Yeah. So basically, the second point is a very important point. We cannot run away from our responsibility towards inclusion. And that responsibility is essentially, morally, and ethically in nature.
Mes negalime iš tikrųjų nusikratyti savo atsakomybės sukurti tą inkluzinę švietimo sistemą, nes tai yra kaip esmė.
Okay. Now let's start with inclusive cultures in our school. So now we're moving from policy to cultures in school. Okay? So we're not speaking outside, but now we're speaking inside our theater, inside our space, which is the school and the classroom. And these are some of the dimensions of a truly inclusive culture in our schools. The dimension creates secure, accepting, collaborating, stimulating community in which everyone is valued as the foundation for the highest achievements of all. It develops shared inclusive values that are conveyed to all members of the school's community. Notice the language here. There is an emphasis on the concept of the school as a community, where values are known, values are shared, and the space which is the school is a secure space. It's a space marked by trust between the different stakeholders.
saugumo jausmas, priėmimas, bendradarbiavimas, bendruomenės kūrimas, kurioje visi yra vertinami ir visi galime pasiekti daugiau, išnaudoti savo potencialą ir pasiekti gero daugiausiai. Na, tai, kad tos bendros vertybės labai svarbu.
This is very, very different from the traditional school, where children from early in their life are asked to compete and to compete against each other.
Tai labai prieštarauja tam, kas iš tikrųjų vyksta mokykloje, kai vaikai skatinami rungtyniauti ir rungtis tarpusavyje, konkuruoti, jie yra lyginami.
And this is very also different from the traditional school where, the teacher is expert, has expert knowledge, and no one will dare, challenge his or her expert knowledge.
Ir tai yra labai kitoniška lyginant su tradicinė mokykla, kurioje mokytojas turi, kaip prisėmęs eksperto rolę, kuris viską žino ir, kaip nelabai galima jam prieštarauti.
This is also very different from the traditional school where teachers are experts and anyone coming from outside is not an expert and therefore he is or she is inferior and preferably stays outside the school.
Ir taip pat mokytojas negali būti ekspertas ne tik vaikams, bet ir tiems, kurie ateina į mokyklą iš šalies, nes tuomet tie žmonės tiesiog liausis sėja, nes jeigu aš ateinu ir mokytojas yra tas, kuris viską žino ir jam negalima nieko pasakyti, tai gal aš kaip neisiu.
So this is a school which is perceived as a community where stakeholders, be it teachers, be it heads of school, be it parents, be it members of the community, can contribute, to the school.
Tai mokykla iš tikrųjų turi būti ta bendruomenė, kurioje visos interesuotos šalys, kas tai galbūt ar tėvai, ar besimokantys, jie iš tikrųjų gali turėti įtakos ir bendrai.
So in my teacher training, not only initial but also in service teacher training, this is the scenario where we set benchmarks and we reflect on what we mean by an inclusive school and we reflect on where we are in terms of inclusion. Inclusion is not just rhetoric. We want inclusive school. Inclusion is a commitment. And there is a very clear distinction between an inclusive and a non-inclusive school. So beyond the rhetoric on inclusion and democracy, etc., there is a commitment and very clear benchmarks of what an inclusive school looks like. So I gave you an idea what inclusive policies are like. Then we moved on to inclusive cultures. Now I come back to them. Now I move on to the concept of inclusive practices inside the classroom. Now, this is one statement. Obviously, we need to unpack the statement. We do not have the time, but I will give you an idea of what I do to unpack the statement. So, basically, in terms of practices, lessons are made responsive to student diversity, and students are encouraged to be actively involved in their education, whilst parents and community mobilize to share knowledge and experience in the spirit of collaboration. So, basically, there is a shift in practices from the traditional school to the inclusive school. In the traditional school, students are perceived as empty-minded. So you come in and I fill you with information, transmit the information, pack the information, and then ask you to give me back all that information at a certain point in your life. That is the traditional school. Now, an inclusive school valorizes students' experience, adults' experience, etc. That's where it starts.
Taigi, tradicinė mokykla nuo inkluzinės skiriasi tuo, kad tradicinėje mokykloje mokiniai ateina ir į juos žiūrima kaip į tokius tuščius indus, kuriuos reikia pripildyti žiniomis, kurias jie vėliau atkartotų atsiskaitymuose ir egzaminuose. O inkluzinėje mokykloje priešingai kreipiamas dėmesys yra į mokinių įvairovę, į jų asmeninės patirtis, į jų norus. Tiesiog jie yra įtraukiami į švietimo procesą.
Okay, this is a beginning of what? An inclusive school, a school as community looks like. Look at some of the benchmarks that we use to assess whether a school is truly inclusive or not.
Taigi skaidriai išvardinami kriterijai, kuriais žiūrima, ar mokykla yra iš tiesų inkluzinė. Taigi, should I name some of these?
Yeah.
Kiekvienas jaučiasi priimtas, mokiniai vieni kitiems padeda, mokytojai bendradarbiauja tarpusavyje, mokiniai ir mokytojai elgiasi pagarbiai vieni su kitais, partnerystė tarp mokytojų ir tėvų. Mokytojai ir taryba dirba tarpusavyje gerai ir vietinė bendruomenė yra įtraukta į mokyklos gyvenimą.
Now, inclusion, there are aspects of inclusion which cost a lot of money. Now look at these benchmarks, okay? And you suddenly realize that there are various aspects, lots of aspects of inclusion that cost nothing. It's a change of attitude, it's a change of relationships, it's a change of culture.
Dažnai perėjimas prie inkluzinio ugdymo gali kainuoti daug pinigų, tačiau iš šitų išvardintų punktų mes matome, kad esmė yra ne pinigai, o pačių žmonių požiūrio, pokytis požiūriai.
So many aspects of inclusion in the classroom or in the school that do not cost any money. It's a change of values. It's a change of expectations.
Taigi dažnai inkluzinėme ugdyme pokyčiai nekainuoja nieko, tiesiog reikia pakeisti savo vertybes ir savo požiūrį.
So these are some of the values that we exchange with schools who want to move from the traditional hierarchical approach to a truly inclusive approach.
Mokyklos, kurios nori tapti inkluzinės, jose turėtų vyrauti vertybės kaip dideli lūkesčiai visiems. Visi bendruomenės nariai laikosi tos inkluzinės filosofijos. Mokiniai yra vienodai vertinami ir mokiniai jaučiasi, kad jie yra vienodai vertinami. Mokytojai stengiasi pašalinti kliūtis visose mokymo proceso lygėse visada. Ir mokytojai taip pat bando mažinti diskriminaciją įvairių rūšių.
Now, I think the most important element is the second one, that community members share a philosophy of inclusion. The school cannot move from a traditional school to an inclusive school if the stakeholders, the parents, the teachers, the head of school, etc. do not share this philosophy. It cannot happen with one or two enthusiastic teachers.
Svarbiausia, pasak dėstytojo, yra būtent antras punktas, kad visi bendruomenės nariai laikosi tos inkluzinės filosofijos, nes mokykla iš tradicinės inkluzinę nepereis, jeigu visi mokytojai, tėvai, direktorius ir kiti mokyklos bendruomenės nariai nesilaikys tos pačios inkluzinės filosofijos.
Another element of the inclusive school is collaboration. You cannot have an inclusive school where, as I said, students are competing against each other and where teachers do not make time to work together and to reflect together. So togetherness is a basic element of a truly inclusive school. Collaboration is the word.
Bendradarbiavimas yra pagrindinis elementas inkliuzyvios mokyklos, nes mokykloje, kurioje mokiniai tarpusavyje rungtyniauja, kad bus geresnis ir mokytojai nesistengia bendradarbiauti mokyklos labui, tiesiog tos inkliuzijos ir nebus.
Also in inclusive schools, cooperation between students is encouraged.
Taip pat inkliuzyvinėse mokyklose skatinimas bendradarbiavimas tarp pačių mokinių.
So one pedagogy, and I don't know whether you are trained to do so, one pedagogy that dominates the inclusive school is the so-called cooperative learning.
Pedagogikos rūšis, kuri dažniausiai būna taikoma inkliuzyvinėse mokyklose, yra mokymas ir bendradarbiavimas.
So cooperative learning is the dominant pedagogy in inclusive schools.
Mokymas ir bendradarbiavimas yra dominuojanti pedagogikos rūšis inkliuzyvinėse mokyklose.
Another pedagogy which is encouraged in inclusive schools is peer tutoring, where students are teaching other students.
Taip pat skatinama inkliuzyvinėse mokyklose yra tai, kad mokiniai dirbtų kartu su kitais mokiniais ir vieni kitus mokytų tarpusavyje.
And this happens within the classroom, but also within different grades. So students, okay, are encouraged, happenings are created to help, to push or to encourage students from different grades, you know, to help and teach other students from other grades.
Taigi tai vyksta toje pačioje klasėje, tarp bendraklasių, bet taip pat yra skatinama tarp skirtingų klasių, kad vyresni mokytų jaunesnius ir panašiai, kad tarp klasių būtų tas bendradarbiavimas.
So you have cooperative learning, peer tutoring, and project work, where basically the school has 2 or 3 projects every year, and students from different grades are working within this project together.
Taigi turime inkliuzyvinę ugdymo bendradarbiavimą, turime mokymąsi tarpusavyje tarp mokinių ir taip pat projektinį darbą, kai keletą kartų per metus mokiniai yra skatinami atlikti kažkokį projektą su savo bendraklasiais arba kitų klasių mokiniais.
So the central thing is always collaboration to break this competition mode.
Bendradarbiavimas yra pagrindinis dalykas, kuris turėtų panaikinti tą rungtyniavimą tarp mokinių.
Another aspect of pedagogy is activity. In other words, encouraging, okay, students to be active rather than passive. That's one. The other aspect is a commitment towards what we refer to in psychology as higher order thinking skills. Okay? Which means basically creative thinking, critical thinking, problem solving, and that is done mostly within groups, in cooperative learning.
Taigi, mokiniai yra skatinami būti aktyvūs, o ne pasyvūs mokymosi procese ir taip pat taikoma metodika, juos skatina kūrybiškai, kritiškai mąstyti, spręsti problemas.
Okay, is it clear? Okay, now that is basically a general picture. Now what I do in service training with my teachers is to take different aspects of collaboration and let them reflect, okay, whether they are engaged in inclusive practices or not.
Taigi, norint sužinoti, ar užsiema inkliuzyviniu ugdymu kuri nors mokykla, dėstytojas pateikia šios klausimus ir leidžia mokytojams pačioms mokykloms juos atsakyti.
Just a moment. So, here I will give you one aspect of the concept of inclusive communities. Student collaboration. So we take student collaboration and we spend an afternoon, okay, reflecting on student collaboration in one school. Why? because in many schools that I attend, teachers make time to stop and reflect. And these are some of the reflections that I go through with my teachers.
Taigi jis, kai apsilanko mokykloje, padeda mokytojams su inkliuzinio ugdymo inkorporavimu, tai jie su mokytojais praleidžia pusę dienos, kartais reflektuodami į tam tikrus klausimus, pavyzdžiui, ar mokiniai bendradarbiauja tarpusavy.
So in my presentation today, I spoke a lot about student collaboration. So this is the reflection on student collaboration in the schools I attend.
Taigi, tokie reflektyvieji klausimai yra jo aplankytose mokyklose užduodami, jie susijęs su būtent mokinių bendradarbiavimo klausimais.
So the first question that I normally challenge teachers with is, are students actively encouraged to help each other?
Taigi, pirmas klausimas yra, ar mokiniai yra skatinami vieni kitiems padėti.
Okay, in the classrooms and in the schools, there are lots of displays of students' work. Is this work reflecting, okay, collaboration, or is it just individual work?
Ar mokinių darbas pamokose ir tarpusavyje jis atspindi bendradarbiavimą, ar tai yra tiesiog individualus kiekvieno mokinio darbas?
Are students encouraged to obviously make friendships from different grades?
Ar mokiniai yra skatinami susidraugauti su kitais mokiniais, ypač iš kitų klasių?
Okay, an inclusive school is a school which has minimum bullying in terms of, racist issues, sexist issues, homophobic, disabled issues, etc. So there will be a reflection on bullying. Normally, traditional schools which emphasize competition, okay, have a high incidence, okay, of bullying. On the contrary, schools which have an inclusive culture, schools which actively promote inclusion, have a much less or smaller incidence of bullying. So there will be a point where we reflect on bullying inside, okay, the classroom and inside the school. And the reflection that we will have as a fourth reflection is, okay, is there a high incidence of bullying inside the classroom or inside the school? Why is it happening if it is happening? So the fourth, okay, benchmark of student collaboration is a low level of bullying inside the school. Bullying does not just happen, it is structural. Okay? And the more competitive the school is, the more individualistic the school is, the larger is the rate of bullying most of the time.
Taigi ketvirtas klausimas, dėl kurio dėstytojas prašo reflektuoti mokykloje, yra patyčios mokykloje. Jis sako, kad inkliuzinį ugdymą ir kultūrą taikančios mokyklos, jose patyčių lygis bus mažesnis negu tradicinėse mokyklose, nes mokiniai yra skatinami bendradarbiauti tarpusavyje, vieni kitus suprasti, draugauti. Ir patyčios yra struktūrinė problema, kai įsigali tam tikros struktūros mokyklose ir vienos grupės tyčiojasi iš kitų, o inkliuzinėse mokyklose ta problema sumažėja. Taip pat, taigi, tai yra vienas svarbus klausimų, kurį mes turime reflektuoti, norėdami atsakyti klausimą, ar mūsų mokykla yra inkliuzinė.
Tose mokyklose, kurios yra mokiniai tarpusavy panašūs ir vyrai, kurios
Patyčių lygis yra aukštesnis mokyklose, kur tradicinis ugdymas taikomas ir yra daugiau mokiniai tarpusavyje varžosi būti geresni.
Okay, the fifth point, the fifth reflection is, are students encouraged to celebrate, okay, each other's achievements?
Penktas punktas yra, ar mokiniai yra skatinami džiaugtis vieni kitų pasiekimais.
And the other point would be, in case of disputes, do students feel that they are being treated fairly?
Ir jeigu kyla konfliktų, kitas punktas čia jau yra, jeigu kyla konfliktų, ar mokiniai jaučiasi, kad su jais elgiamasi teisingai konfliktų atveju?
Another aspect of collaborative school is the issue of respect for student voice. So the next question would be, are the opinions of students thought about how the school can be improved?
Taigi kitas svarbus aspektas yra mokykloje, kurioje taikomas bendradarbiavimas, yra ar mokinių norai ir balsai yra gerbiami. Taigi pirmas klausimas yra, ar mokinių nuomonė yra, ar klausoma mokinių, kaip galima būtų pagerinti mokykloje esančią situaciją.
And obviously I will not go through the rest, but basically the issue is, are students encouraged to work collaboratively? Are students' achievements, celebrated collaboratively? Are students' voices dealt with effectively and celebrated? Do students feel that they are part of this organization called the school?
Taigi esmė yra, ar mokiniai yra skatinami bendradarbiauti, ar jie bendrai džiaugiasi vieni kitų pasiekimais, ar jų nuomonė atsižvelgiama ir ar jie yra įtraukiami į mokyklos kūrimo procesą ir mokyklos gyvenimą.
Now, if you look at these two slides, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the rest, I would guess 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 in all. So we're focusing on one little aspect of the inclusive school. And what you notice is that there is no one aspect that costs money. It's a question of a change of culture, a change of attitude, and a change of practice. So for those who think that inclusion always costs money, there are lots of aspects in inclusion which cost nothing. And that is a very important, message that I want to send today. Before we start thinking of how expensive the movement from the traditional to inclusive school can be, the message is very clear. There are lots of things that we have to do which cost nothing, but cost a lot of time, cost a lot of reflection, and cost a lot of action.
Svarbi žinia, kurią jūs norite šiandien įsisąmonintumėt, kaip matome iš 20 klausimų išvardinti dviejose skaidrėse, yra tai, kad inkliuzinio ugdymo įvedimas dažnai mes manome, kad kainuoja labai daug, bet iš tiesų tai nekainuoja pinigais nieko, tai tiesiog mes turime skirti tam laiką, pakeisti savo mąstymą ir suvokti, kad nebūtinai mes turim leisti pinigus, kad tas inkliuzinis ugdymas įsigalėtų, tiesiog mes turim patys pakeisti savo mąstymą.
So inclusion will never come about unless we stop and reflect about our action. And we act on the basis of our reflection. Inclusion will never come unless these two elements come together. Ongoing reflection informing action and reflection based on action. If you do not have time for reflection, if you do not make time in your schools to reflect, forget change and forget transformation, you will never achieve anything unless you appreciate the importance of ongoing reflection as an integral part of your culture inside the schools.
Inkluzija nevyks mokyklose, jeigu mes neskirsime laiko reflektuoti ir nesimsime veiksmų, kurie bus paremti mūsų refleksija.
Okay, so what I'm trying to tell you here today is, of course, to foreground the importance of reflection in action, but also to show you how complex the movement from the traditional system into a truly inclusive system is.
Taigi, jūs nori parodyti, koks komplikuotas yra perėjimas iš tradicinės sistemos mokyklos į inkliuzinę ir kokia svarbi yra refleksijos, koks svarbus yra refleksijos vaidmuo tame procese.
Yeah, it's very complex. And throwing money at the system will not bring about change.
Ir pokyčiai jiems skiriant pinigus tam procesui, turi keistis mūsų mąstymas.
Okay, so this is a very important message because it's happening at the moment in my country, where we have a government, the economy is booming, and we think that, you know, because we have the money and throw the money at the system, there will be change. Life is much more complex than simply throwing money, lots of money, okay, 6% of our GDP, lots of money at the system. It will not bring change.
Taigi, Maltoje šiuo metu vyksta tie pokyčiai, kai manoma, jog jeigu skirsime daugiau pinigų pokyčiams mokyklose, bandantis paversti labiau pliusinėmis, tuomet problema bus išspręsta, tačiau negalvojama apie kitus aspektus, kaip noras keistis ir pačių mokytojų pasirinkimas.
So a strong economy is not a guarantee of an inclusive, an inclusive society and an inclusive education system.
Taigi stipri ekonomika, ekonominė padėtis šalyje nėra garantija, kad inkliuzinis ugdymas bus įvykdytas ir kad jis bus sėkmingas.
On the contrary, what we're seeing, not only in my country but in Europe in general, the gaps, between the children in schools and eventually between adults in society are growing and not closing.
Kaip tik priešingai labiau pasiturinčiose šalyse matome, kad atskirtis tarp mokyklose ir vėliau suaugusiųjų didėja, o ne mažėja.
And it is very clear in my mind that there is a connection between the gaps that we see at school within the education system and the gaps that we see outside the school within society.
Jis mano, kad yra labai aiškus ryšys tarp skirtumų, kuriuos matome švietimo sistemoje, tarp vaikų ir vėliau tarp suaugusiųjų už mokyklos ribų.
So let's go back to the reflections that I normally conduct in schools. I mentioned the importance of collaboration, between parents and schools. So first we reflected on collaboration between students. Now, another dimension of collaboration is the collaboration between school and parents. See how complex it is. One word I've mentioned, collaboration. And that word has different dimensions. And that is only one word. Okay? There are several other aspects of inclusion, but I'm speaking only of one word, which is collaboration. Now there is collaboration between students, there is collaboration between teachers and students, there is collaboration between staff and teachers, there is collaboration between parents and the school, there is collaboration between community and the school, and it's only on one word, which is collaboration. Okay? That goes to show you how complex the movement from a traditional hierarchical approach to a truly inclusive approach is. It's very complex. And we cannot make this shift, we cannot make this move unless we stop and reflect. Unless there is, or there are people who help you, critical friends, who help you reflect on where we are, that's why the questions, and where we want to be. Yes.
Vien iš to vieno žodžio bendradarbiavimas mes suprantame, kaip sudėtinga yra iš tradicijų sistemos įtvirtinimo, nes bendradarbiavimas turi būti tarp pačių, jo dėstytojas naudoja siekdamas
on collaboration between parents and schools. So, I think among the most important questions that I ask is the first question. Do parents and staff respect each other?
Svarbiausias klausimas susijęs su mokyklų ir tėvų bendradarbiavimu yra tai, ar tėvai ir mokytojai vieni kitus gerbia.
I've conducted research among schools in disadvantaged areas, and what I discovered is that most teachers in these schools do not want to be in these schools, and therefore they see parents as inferior others. And how can you collaborate if you walk into a classroom or into a school as a teacher with that kind of mentality?
Taigi jis atliko tyrimus mokyklose, kuriuose daugiausiai yra socialinės rizikos grupėse esantys vaikai. Ir sužinojo, kad dažniausiai mokytojai patys jie nenori būti tose mokyklose. Taigi kaip galima atlikti savo darbą, kai tu nenori dirbti su vaikais, su kuriais tu turėtum dirbti.
So respect is very fundamental in any relationship. And if there is no mutual respect, and if there is mistrust between the two stakeholders, there will never be real, authentic collaboration.
Taigi pagarba yra tiesiog bazinė vertybė, be kurios nebus bendradarbiavimo tarp mokyklos ir tėvų, nes jeigu tu negerbi vienas kito, kaip tu gali dirbti kartu.
I think the last one is very important too. What kind of opportunities does the school give for different parents with different abilities, with different time to collaborate and to be involved?
Ir taip pat jo manimų paskutinis klausimas yra labai svarbus. Tai yra, kokias galimybės suteikia mokykla tėvams, kurie turi skirtingus gebėjimus ir gali skirtingai laiko skirti mokyklai. Kokias mokykla galimybės suteikia jiems prisidėti prie mokyklos veiklos?
So ultimately, the message is very clear. I don't have the time to give any more details because this is not a lecture on parental involvement, but the message is very clear. A school that physically and mentally leaves parents outside is not an inclusive school.
Taigi, žinutė aiškiai, kad mokykla, kuri tiek fiziškai, tiek savo mąstymų tėvus palieka už borto, negali būti inkluzinė.
Now, let's move from culture to practices. And this is another aspect of inclusion. The level of, involvement of students in their own learning.
Taigi, dabar pereisim prie praktikos, tai yra mokinių įtraukimas į mokymosi procesą.
As I said, some of the schools that I'm involved with are trying to move from a pedagogical approach where basically everything moves around the teacher. The teacher is the transmitter of knowledge and the students are receivers of knowledge. That is the kind of relationship that some of the schools are struggling with and they are trying to move away from. Okay, so many schools that I work with are struggling to move from that kind of culture.
Taigi, dauguma mokyklų, su kuriomis jis dirba, stengiasi ir jiems labai sunku nutolti nuo pedagoginės kultūros, kurioje mokiniai yra skatinami tiesiog išmokti žinias ir jas įsisąmoninti, bet patys nieko nereflektuoti ir tiesiog nukopijuoti tai, ką jis pateikia mokytojai.
So one of the first questions I asked the teachers is this scenario in your school typical where teacher talks and students take notes and basically return them at the end of the semester with tests? If that is the case, obviously we are in trouble. Because that is a scenario that is anything but inclusive. That is a scenario that is anything but democratic. That is a scenario, which is anything but collaborative in nature. So that is a scenario which is far removed from our vision of a truly inclusive culture.
Taigi, jeigu jūs paklausia klausimo, ar pamokų procese mokytojai tiesiog diktuoja informaciją, mokiniai ją užsirašo ir po to atsiskaito, ir mokyklos pasako, kad taip, tai tada jos pateko į bėdą, nes tai yra kultūra, kuri tiesiog skatina ne pačius mokinius mąstyti, o įsisąmoninti mokytojų žinias ir daugiau kaip ir nieko nedaryti. Taip, tiesiog toli nuo inkliuzijos.
Then we check assessment, of course. And the second question would be, are children given the opportunity to express themselves, in different ways? Because we know through research that there are multiple intelligences, there are different learning styles, there are different learning patterns. Where is this reflected in your pedagogy? I get the impression that we learn a lot about multiple intelligences, learning styles and learning patterns at university, and then we go to school and we say that is rubbish, this is a different reality. There is a disconnection between university and school. When we know research after research after research is showing us that in front of us we have children with different styles, different patterns, different intelligences, etc. Where is this theory reflected in schools?
Taigi, antras klausimas yra, ar mokiniai yra skatinami išreikšti savo žinias įvairiais metodais, įvairiais būdais, nes mes žinome, kad kiekvienas žmogus ir mokinys turi skirtingą mokymosi stilių, vieniems geriau veikia vieni metodai, kitiems kiti, ir mes turime suteikti jiems visiems galimybės išsireikšti, kaip jiems yra patogiau.
So when I walk into a traditional classroom in Lithuania, it could be anywhere, my question is this teacher aware that there is 21st century research showing us that students are different? Or is this teacher aware and he or she is doing nothing about it? And this is not a rhetorical question. This is a very serious question that I am asking. If we are not aware of truckloads of research showing us that students are different and learn differently, then we are in trouble here. Then our faculties are not doing their job. If we are aware and doing nothing about it, that is even worse for me. It is showing that faculties are there simply to certify you as teachers and nothing else.
Taigi, kai jis nueina į mokyklą, jo pirmas klausimas yra, ar mokytojai žino, kad 21 amžiuje yra gausybė įvairių tyrimų rodančių, kad mokinių mokymosi stilius yra skirtingas. Ir jeigu viena išvada yra, jeigu jie tai žino ir nieko ne. Jeigu jie nežino, tai jie turėtų žinoti, o jeigu nežino ir nieko nedaro, tai yra dar blogiau, nes tai reiškia, kad jie nenori keistis ir jie nenori keisti savo mokymo metodikos. Ir tiesiog dirba toje erdvėje, kuri jiems yra palankiausia ir patogiausia.
Up to a few years ago, the evidence was coming from psychology. Now it's coming from neuroscience, and it's more precise. But the message is very clear. Students learn differently. And we cannot ignore that. Now, by learning differently, I'm not saying that we have to create, if there are 25 children inside the classroom, 25 different curricula. It means basically being aware that there are differences, what the differences are, and at some point during the day or during the week, we address those differences.
Tai reiškia, kad mokiniai kiekvienas turi savo skirtingą mokymosi stilių. Tai nereiškia, kad mes turime kiekvienam sukurti naują tvarkaraštį ir naują mokymo programą. Tai tiesiog reiškia, kad savaitės eigoje mes turime reflektuoti ir suteikti jiems galimybę kiekvienam atsiskaityti, atsižvelgti į jų tiesiog poreikius.
Now, education is becoming a very precise science. Students in different parts of the world are being trained, okay, to measure that difference. So you do not see difference by looking at people's eyes or ears. There are different ways of measuring that difference. So it's very precise. So there's no excuse there. So step number one is to realize this very important point, that children are different, and that one-size-fits-all pedagogy is 19th century pedagogy, not even 20th century. Because we've known these things, for a long time now. Okay? It's not even 20th century pedagogy. It's 19th century pedagogy. So if Lithuania still, okay, considers traditional pedagogy, okay, as an important pedagogy, that is 19th century pedagogy. It's not even 20th century. It's not even 20th century. Because we've known, okay, of this very basic point, okay, long time ago. What we have in 21st century now is more precision and more research coming from all over, okay, not only the world, but from all over the disciplines. So this is a very important point here that we're making.
Švietimas tapo labai tikslių mokslų ir matome, kad toliau daugiau turime tyrimų, kurie paremia tą faktą, jog mokiniai kiekvienas turi mokymosi skirtingą stilių ir jeigu mes to netaikome savo darbe, mes tiesiog dirbame tradicinėje sistemoje, kuri net nėra atitinkanti 20 amžiaus kriterijus, yra labiau 19 amžiaus, nes net 20 amžiuje jau buvo žinoma, kad mokiniai mokosi skirtingai ir jiems jų gabumai yra skirtingi ir jie turi skirtingus mokymosi stilius. Tačiau dabar yra tiesiog atlikta dar daugiau tyrimų pareminčių šią informaciją ir kiekvienas mokytojas turėjo taip atsižvelgti ir taikyti į savo klasę.
So one size fits all is not only obsolete in terms of pedagogy, but it works against the interests of children. If, obviously, we want to take research seriously.
Taigi, tas požiūris, kad vienas dalykas, viena metodika tinka kiekvienam, yra klaidingas ir mes turime keisti šį požiūrį, jeigu norime pereiti į aukštesnį, geresnį švietimo lygį.
And to add insult to injury, a one-size-fits-all is usually a system that addresses the lower order, okay, thinking skills. In other words, memorization, regurgitation, etc. So these are two very little, okay, approaches.
Ir ta metodika, kad kai manome, kad ta pati metodika tinka visiems, ji taiko tokius mokymo principus kaip informacijos kalimas tiesiog, bandymas ją kartoti ir tai yra kaip žemiausias mokymas įvykdymo.
Okay, now this is a very important issue in terms of social justice. Time on task. Now we have to realize that there are children who are very privileged. Let me take my children who very early in their life, they are born not only in a stable family, but in a highly stimulating family. Now that is privilege. But there are millions of children who are not born in that kind of culture, in that kind of family. So it's useless trying to think that we are born equal. We are not. Millions of children are privileged, but several millions are not that privileged.
Taigi, nenaudinga yra mąstyti, kad mes visi gimstame lygus, nes iš tiesų taip realiai nėra, kai kurie vaikai gimsta privilegijuotose šeimose, kur jie yra skatinami mokytis ir yra tas stimulas iš tėvų mokytis, kiti gimsta socialiai tiesiog skurdesniuose šeimose ir kitose sąlygose ir jiems yra suteikiamos skirtingos galimybės. Taigi mes neturėtume mąstyti, kad visi yra vienodai ir turi vienodas galimybės.
Now, this is important. For disadvantaged children, we have to realize that every minute they spend in school is a very important minute. They can't go to the family like my sons do when they come home and expect that their family, okay, or their context is a stimulating context. So the school for many is a very important place. And therefore, every minute they spend inside the classroom is an important minute. And this brings me to the issue of time on task. Look at the research. Okay? Sorry, I'm an academic, so I'm totally dependent on research. It's not just experience or intuition, which I really appreciate, but also I have to bring in research. 30% in most countries is lost through administration, through outside activities, etc. Okay? Now for my children, it makes a difference, but not a lot of difference. But for the disadvantaged, who depend a lot, okay, on the school, that is a huge loss of their time. So time on task is a very important factor when it comes to inclusive practices, when it comes to social justice in our schools. And as you can see, and if you reflect on your own practice, you will realize, okay, what we're trying to say here. A lot of time, okay, is lost, okay, through activities, through administration, etc., which are anything but, okay, educational in nature. 30%, that's a huge amount of time in the year.
Taigi, socialinės rizikos šeimose augantis vaikai, jiems kiekviena minutė mokykloje yra svarbi, nes jie neturi kur, jie kai grįžta namo, jie negali skirti to paties laiko mokymuisi, kur jie skirti mokyklose, jie gal neturi tos aplinkos tinkamos mokymuisi, jiems tėvai negali padėti su dirbamais darbais ir panašiai. Taigi, kiekviena minutė jiems yra svarbi ir tyrimai rodo, kad mokytojai praranda bent 30% savo laiko, kurį turėtų skirti pamokoms, ruošdami įvairias administracinės užduotis ir tokius pašalinius darbus. Todėl patys mokiniai, kuriems labai svarbi yra kiekviena minutė pamokoje, jie gauna mažiau dėmesio iš mokytojų, kurie turi kitų darbų realiai, kurie tie darbai nėra pamokos, yra visokie administraciniai darbai.
So time on task is a huge, okay, social justice issue. The other issue, let me go back, I'm revisiting some of the issues, is the emotional climate inside the school and the classroom. Europe has a very serious problem in terms of its dropout rates from the school. There is a very intimate connection between the school climate and the dropout rates inside the school. Now there are two types of dropouts. There are people who leave the school very early in their life. But there are lots of students who stay in school, but they switch off. The second situation is much more subversive because, you know, students are there physically, but mentally they're not there. So here we have a focus on the importance of creating emotionally sound schools, because there is a link between schools which are intimidating, schools which are judgmental, schools which instill fear in the students, and this phenomenon of dropping out. So creating positive environments is part of this concept of creating truly and authentically inclusive schools. So we have children in our country who very early in their life, they are labeled as failures. I don't know about here, but unfortunately, we start assessing students very early in their life. And if a child, very early in his or her life, decides that he or she is a failure, she or he will never drink that milk. So lots of children, and I have to say their parents, are switching off because very early in their life, children and parents are being told that their child is a failure. So these kind of systems, education systems, create some of the best minds in Europe, but in the process they waste lots of minds. I will not point any fingers at you because this is my country. We produce some of the best brains in Europe, and that's how we survive without any real resources, but we create a lot of failures. And listen to my language, we create failures. Children are not born failures, we create them. And I have to say that through our participation in this structure, in the system, we are also responsible for this situation. So labeling is one of the problems that we have in an education system that starts assessing, children very early. We know through experience, but also through research, that once children are given a label, they start living, that label, because they start then believing that that label is dead. So as you can see, before we conclude and take some questions perhaps, the traditional system is a very violent system indeed. It's a bully. So we're trying to address bullying when we have a system which is a bully, a big bully, a system which labels children, a system which separates children into different streams, a system which renders the child very passive, very early in his or her life. So, I think the basic start in a movement from a traditional approach to a truly inclusive approach is to stop, reflect, and analyze what is happening inside the classroom, inside the school, and in terms of policy. We need to stop. And we cannot continue blaming the other, because we are in the circle of responsibility, not outside the circle of responsibility.
didesnę galime perkelti atsakomybės kitiems, sakydami, kad tai yra jų kaltė.
Today we have enough research to tell us, okay, that the traditional approach is not in the best interest of children.
Yra pakankamai daug tyrimų, kurie įrodo, kad tas tradicinis švietimas, tas tradicinis požiūris į mokyklą iš tikrųjų netarnauja vaikų interesams.
And when you analyze failure, it's not enough to talk about statistics, but you have to dig deep into who is failing.
Kalbame apie nesėkmę, tai nepakanka žiūrėti statistiką tiesiog, bet reikia analizuoti giliau, kokios priežastys. Kas tai yra, kad nesėkmė.
And when you analyze, in any country across continents who is failing, you will see that disadvantaged children are overrepresented in that category.
Jeigu mes analizuosime viso, galima sakyti, pasaulio tyrimus apie tai, kas yra tie nevykėliai, iš tikrųjų, tai yra tie vaikai iš socialinės rizikos, iš socialinės rizikos. Neturintys tam gerų sąlygų ir tai yra per daug sureikšminama brėžiama. Jų yra taip, tai jų kelias yra labai didelis.
So that is the objective truth, the scientific and empirical truth. Now when confronted with this truth, education has two decisions to make. Either close its eyes and reproduce what is happening and what we know that is happening, or intervene and obviously change policy, culture and practices.
Žinau, kad tuos tyrimus, tai švietimo žmonės turi kažkaip arba mes susimenkime ir toliau einam tuo tradiciniu keliu, arba iš tikrųjų sustojam ir keičiam savo politiką, kultūrą ir praktiką.
We cannot wait for another century. Europe is in trouble, okay, and we have to act.
Negalime laukti dar kito amžiaus, todėl kad Europa iš tikrųjų patiria sunkumų ir mes turime imtis veiksmų.
Before it is too late.
Prieš tai kol nebus per daug.
And that's basically it. Thank you. Can we take a few questions and conversations? Yes, from you.
Gal turite klausimų?
Yeah, go ahead. Let's start.
What do you think of the teacher who is young, comes to school and sees that there are grades, classes, or departments?
Okay. That is, yes, can you translate?
Paklausiau, ką jis dabar jaunam mokytojui, kuris atėjęs į mokyklą, randa tokią pat, kad 45 pamokos,
Okay, that is a very important question, and I am confronted by that question every single day, so I'm prepared. Okay, the individual teacher in the individual classroom cannot wait. And what I do in my training is to show, through example, how even in the most oppressive of institutions, and I spoke a little bit about it yesterday, I can be democratic inside my immediate space, which is the classroom. So my training, my personal training, takes my students to 3 different levels. As advocates at the national level, struggling for policies, as actors within the school, and as actors within the classroom. So if nothing works, at least I have my space. And there's no excuse. I can do something in my space.
na, jau kai jėgų klasė iš tikrųjų nėra pritraukta, tikrai gali imtis tam tikro veiksmo atsakomybės ir kaip aš čia darau.
So faculties and teacher training institutions have this responsibility to drill in students' mind that they can do something. The worst thing that they can happen to him or her is to walk out of the faculty thinking that they can do nothing. And faculty members, staff, have to set the example. And yesterday I gave 2 examples of how, even with 100 students around me, I engaged in dialogue with students. I also explained yesterday how I changed in my assessment system from a traditional approach to a more democratic and open approach where students can bring in all the material in their exam because I do not give exams where memory is important. So revolution starts, from the faculty. Students have to see that their professors are coherent. They're not just preaching democracy, but they are doing democracy with their students. Democracy and inclusion are rooted in action. So what I do with my students is go to schools, go to communities, and do pedagogy in schools and communities, not preach from the faculty.
Ir toliau taip, jie nusineša tą kultūrą į mokyklą ir tiesiog tai pasklinda toliau.
Unfortunately, many academics have a problem with regard to credibility because they speak, but they do not do. Credibility stands in speaking and doing. Students have to see coherence in us, in me, to start with.
Sako, labai didelė problema, kad kartais, kaip dėstytojai nedaro to, apie ką jie kalba. Ir iš tikrųjų studentai tada gal išmoksta, patikės, jie matys, kad patys dėstytojai daro tai, apie ką moko, kaip turėtų dirbti, pavyzdžiui.
I have no problem with persuading my students that inclusion is possible, because I do inclusion in schools with them and not preach about it.
Sako, man nesunku įtikinti savo studentus dėl to inkluzinės mokyklos idėjai, nes aš pats tai darau savo mokyklose ir taip dirbu. Tai iš tikrųjų dera, tai daro.
And I hope I will come back and show, rather than speak like today. Any questions? Please. Go ahead.
Okay, I think this is okay within the school and with the students, but how can you involve the parents to tell them all the information or all the facts you told us today? Are you educating also like parents' evenings or whatever?
Yeah. So, as you saw, parents play a very important role. So when we speak of collaboration, we speak of parent programs which happen either during the day or in the evenings. So there is a parent program running parallel to this. parent programs are not just happening face-to-face, because there are lots of parents who cannot come to school because obviously of work, etc. Some of it is happening online already now.
Ir sako, nebūtinai sutikti tėvus gyvai, dėl to, kad ne visada tai yra įmanoma, bet na, technologijos gali tai padaryti, leidžia tai padaryti nuotoliniu būdu.
So the state and also the independent schools have introduced a platform now.
Valstybė nepriklausomos mokyklos iš tikrųjų nustatė platformą, kuri tėvų įtraukimo.
And parents are informed every single day, and I am a parent, I know what is happening, on schoolwork, homework, curriculum, tests, etc. Every single day.
Ir tėvai yra kiekvieną mielą dieną informuojami apie mokyklos programą, tvarkaraščius, namų darbus ir sako, aš esu pasiekus ir irgi gaunu kiekvieną dieną informaciją.
That is my situation at the moment.
But how are you involved, like you are getting information, how can you react on it, or...
No, that is basic information. I mean, as a parent, I know what my child is doing in terms of curriculum, in terms of homework, in terms of classwork, in terms of forthcoming testing, etc.
We have also such thing with
Is it happening?
in terms of information, yes, they are informed in this way, and they can relay also.
Okay, that is basic. Then obviously some schools are experimenting with policy making. And that is the most difficult level in terms of parental involvement. When I come back and do the course on parental involvement, I will give the different levels of parental involvement. The most difficult to accept as far as schools are concerned is the concept of the parent as a policy maker.
Ir sako, taip, aš jam pasakiau, kad Lietuvoje mes turime tuos dėjimus, kuriuose tėvai iš tikrųjų yra informuojami apie tuos dalykus, ką jis minėjo. Ir tai nepritarė, kad tai yra iš tikrųjų pats tas žemiausias lygmuo. Tiesiog informavimo, bet tos drąsesnės mokyklos, tai jos iš tikrųjų tėvus įtraukia ir į mokyklos politikos formavimą. Ir tai jau yra daug sunkiau. Iš tikrųjų nepamėsiu.
But now, can you imagine a policy on nutrition without the participation of parents?
Sako, jūs galite įsivaizduoti, pavyzdžiui, mokyklos nuostatas dėl vaikų mitybos, bet dėl įtraukimų.
For policies to work, you need ownership. And you can only gain ownership through participation. Tėvai turi būti tarsi jaustis, kad jie yra bendrasavininkai mokyklos, kad iš tikrųjų jie galėtų formuoti tą politiką. It's part of them, you know? Yes. Ownership. Yes. Taip, kad jie jaustųsi mokyklos dalininkais, lygiaverčiais, kartu su vadovais. It's not in the best interest of any school to exclude parents. It's not in the best interest. Tai nėra mokyklos interesuose atskirti iš tikrųjų. Another policy that comes to mind is that on discipline. How can you exclude, parents from a policy on discipline? Arba, pavyzdžiui, sakykime, kaip galime atskirti tėvus nuo disciplinos formavimo nuostatų. Kaip mes, pavyzdžiui, elgsime su netinkamai besielgiančiais vaikais, kokių imsimės priemonių, tai kaip galime neįtraukti tėvų į tuos sprendimus. I've been working with parents for the last 20 years. Never a problem, but it has always been a relationship based on mutual respect. Sako, aš jau 20 metų dirbu su tėvais, bet ir niekada nebuvo problemų, todėl kad tas ryšys remiasi abipusę pagrindą. And it is all kinds of parents, not privileged parents. Ir tai tikrai nėra tie vien privilegijuoti tėvai, tai yra visi tėvai. Any questions? Yes.
You said that you don't need money in order to change the attitudes and mental state of teachers. But what is, in your your opinion, what are the most important attitudes and values that inclusive pedagogue or teachers have?
In terms of his behavior inside the classroom or
Yes.
in general? Okay. Okay. I think inclusion is based on, okay, diversity. And that is the biggest challenge that we have inside the classroom, especially with the new wave of migration that we are experiencing. Okay? And that is why I explained yesterday that we challenge, okay, prospective teachers, okay, individually. Because we cannot afford to have racists teaching our kids.
Čia buvo klausimas, kad jis sakė, kad svarbiausia keičiant švietimą link inkliuzijos pakeisti savo nuostatas. Ir klausimas buvo, kokia pagrindinė gal vertybė turėtų vadovautis pedagogas, inkliuzinis pedagogas. Buvo patikslinta, kad ar klasėje, atsakymas buvo taip. Ir pagrindinė vertybė tai yra įvairovės gebėjimas priimti įvairovę. Nes įvairovė turi galvoje migraciją ir kitus veiksmus, kas vyksta, tai iš tikrųjų yra tai, su kuo turėsime sudirbti, yra labai svarbu gebėti priimti, nes mes negalime, sakė rasistų ar ne, tiesiog leisti mokyklą, dirbti su mūsų vaikais, nes su ta įvairovė, kokios galime tikėtis, tai tikrai nesuvyks.
So 1/3 of 4 years of teacher training is dedicated to these issues. Because we want to interrogate, we want to challenge, and we want to problematize, okay, prospective teachers' attitudes towards diversity in all its forms. I mentioned racism, it could be sexism, it could be homophobia, it could be anything.
Ir sako, kad labai didelis trečdalis studijų yra skirta būtent būsimo pedagogo gebėjimui dirbti su mokinių įvairovė. Tai nebūtinai rasės atžvilgiu, bet visa plačiaja prasme, kokia tai galima įvardinti tą įvairovę.
So an inclusive teacher is one who is not afraid of diversity in all its forms. Diversity in terms of social backgrounds, diversity in terms of learning styles, diversity in terms of intelligences, diversity in terms of learning patterns, etc. Okay?
Tai jisai sako, kad pagrindinis dalykas, su kuo turi gebėti dirbti inkliuzinis pedagogas, tai yra įvairovė plačiaja prasme, tai ir mokymos stilių įvairovė ir intelektų įvairovės nori atsižvelgti ir kilmę laiko, iš tai kokios išėjus socialinės aplinkos yra atėjęs, plačiausia prasme, kad galima mokyti tą įvairovę.
So if a teacher is allergic to diversity, you can give him or her the best conditions. 10 children instead of 25, the best resources, you will not apply diversity or differentiation in that classroom. So it all starts from here.
Viskas prasideda nuo mąstymo ir jeigu pedagogas yra alergiškas įvairoviai, tai galime jam duoti vietoj 25 vaikų 10 ir duoti rimčiausius šaltinius, tas priemonė dalį, bet jis vis tiek nesugebės, iš tikrųjų, fiziškai dirbti 20 vaikų.
So our teachers have been telling us, give us smaller and smaller classrooms. Now because of demography and population, many classrooms are 1 to 15 the most. And still, in some classrooms are not seeing any differentiation or any celebration of diversity. Okay? So it all starts with the attitude. Okay?
Dėl demografinių priežasčių ir dėl to, kad lūkesčių pedagogams daro spaudimą, sako, tokį pamusius mažesnės klases ir dabar tikrai tos klasės yra žymiai mažesnis, bet neatrodo, kad tas mažėjęs mokinių skaičius padėtų jiems geriau diferencijuoti mokymą ir atsižvelgti į tą įvairovę.
So sometimes I feel, as far as my country is concerned, that teachers are too comfortable in the very traditional way. Okay? And lack of resources, lots of students is just an excuse in many cases.
Ir jam taip atrodo, kad mokytojai tiesiog, kaip nieko nedaryti, nepaisant to, kad yra tiek daug tyrimų ir sąlygos iš tikrųjų dirbti kitaip. Na, jums tiesiog
Yes. I have a few questions. What is your opinion on student self-governance?
One?
Student self-governance, for example, parliaments.
Yeah.
And what can be done if the parliaments themselves are not very inclusive, for example, for students from poorer backgrounds?
Okay, that is a very important question. We have student councils in our schools. And we did research on those student councils, and we found out that those student councils are most of the time dominated by teachers. So they are not student councils at all. Okay? So school councils are giving us the impression that students are involved. When you analyze what is happening, the agenda is dominated by the school. Okay? And what happens between the discussion and the action, okay, is most of the time hijacked by the teacher staff. So, in general, okay, student councils in theory contribute, but we have to make sure that the student voice is a real student voice. In our case, we have studied student councils twice. I've supervised 2 different dissertations, and what we discovered in these student councils is that there is a lot of manipulation going on, okay, by the school. Right? So theoretically, definitely, I'm for student councils. They contribute to democracy, but we need research to see what is happening, with these student councils. This is the beauty of research. Without research, we can say lots of things, but I'm telling you what is happening exactly in my country as far as student councils are concerned. They are being manipulated and hijacked, okay, by teachers inside the school. Why? Because the school culture is not prepared to open up. So even if there is a structure called student council that is meant to give student voice, it's being manipulated, squaring the circle all the time.
Klausimas buvo, kokia nuomonė apie mokinių savivaldą. Pasakytas savivalda nėra fizinė, bet profesorius atsakė, kad jų šalyje buvo atlikti 2 ar daugiau tyrimų. Tai buvo būtent tyriama mokinių savivalda ir tie tyrimai parodė, kad iš tikrųjų tos savivaldos kaip ir nėra, nes mokinių požiūris, tai, kai jie deklaruoja kaip mokinių požiūrį, yra labai stipriai veikiamas pedagogų. Ir kad tai iš tikrųjų lemia būtent ta kultūra, apie kurią jis kalbėjo, kuri nepasiruošusi atvirumui ir priėmimui. Ir todėl, galima daug kalbėti apie tai, kodėl yra vertinga turėti mokinių savivaldą, bet tyrimai tradicinė mokykla iš tikrųjų tam nebeverti.
Čia kalbam apie mokyklą.
Ne. We speak about secondary education, not about the higher education, or also the higher.
Yeah, but we're talking about secondary education. Yeah. Secondary education. Yeah. Any more questions? Statements? It's my life. That's why it's so passionate. Okay? I do not just read books and repeat. It's my life. 20 years of experience.
Aš esu apie tai kalbu taip aistringai, todėl kad tai nėra tik iš knygų skaitimo, tai yra iš mano realaus gyvenimo 20 metų tai darau ir tuo labai
Thank you.